stunning victory of the Allied coalition forces in the Gulf War raises intriguing questions on the nature of modern warfare. Desert Storm was won using the lessons of the Vietnam War. This program examines some of the lessons from the Gulf War that will influence the future direction of the world's armed forces. The Gulf War was dominated by air power. In no recent war has air power played so decisive a role in its eventual outcome. The considerable Allied advantages in air power allowed the Gulf Coalition to define the way the war would be fought. Instead of a direct ground assault on the Iraqi army in occupied Kuwait, the Allied offensive would begin with prolonged air attacks. These would sap the strength of the more numerous Iraqi army before a ground offensive began. The success of the initial Allied air onslaught was based in no small measure on the weakness of the Iraqi response. Dr. Seth Karras has studied the Iraqi army for a number of years.
I think what it amounted to is that they got overwhelmed. They knew there was a danger. They were ready for it, but they didn't really understand the magnitude of what was about to hit them. And the U.S. Air Force went into this campaign with more than a decade's worth of training and doctrinal thinking about how you go against air defenses. Basically, probably better prepared than any other Air Force has ever been to deal with air defenses. Going up against an air defense system which is a typical third world system. Not bad, but by no means as dense or as sophisticated as some of the ones that the U.S. Air Force plans against. As a result, I think that the U.S. Air Force was basically able to overwhelm what the Iraqis had there.
U.S. planners expected the Iraqis to vigorously resist an air assault. As the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Navy had learned at great cost in the Vietnam War, modern air defense systems such as missiles and radar-directed guns could take a lethal toll on attack aircraft. It was the lessons of the Vietnam War that led the American Air Forces to devote considerable attention to new methods to overcome enemy air defenses. David Isby has written numerous studies on modern armies and is the author of a recent report on the impact of electronic warfare in the Gulf War.
The Iraqi air defense network was basically defeated in the first 24 hours. After that, it was reduced to a residual level of effectiveness, and while it required sorties, aircraft to be directed against it for the remainder of the war, it was really not going to be a factor in the ultimate outcome. Now, there are a number of reasons for this. One is that Iraq had never really emphasized its air defenses in the way other countries such as North Vietnam during the Vietnam War, Syria and Egypt during the Middle East wars in the 1970s had emphasized it. The Iraqi military was built to fight Iran, built against potential threats from its other Arab neighbors or Israel, and it looked much more to a ground threat rather than a sophisticated air threat. Another reason the Iraqi air defense collapsed was the sheer size and sophistication of the effort put against it. Electronic warfare was used against Iraqi air defenses to a degree never seen before in any conflict. Much more of it, much more sophisticated than had been seen in Vietnam, than had been seen in earlier wars in the Middle East. And finally, you had a system which was over-centralized, dependent on a number of nodes, command centers, that once they were taken out, and we saw many of these were destroyed in the opening minutes of the war by F-117 stealth fighters, Tomahawk missiles, or even in the case of some radars, Apache helicopters, the system started to come unglued, and within a few days it was unglued. They were also unwilling really to take the losses and fight once they saw the overwhelming force against them. So Iraqi air defenses preceded the Iraqi ground forces and the Iraqi Navy into utter defeat.
The success of the Allied air attacks also hinged on the poor performance of the Iraqi Air Force. The Iraqis had the semblance of a modern air force, with first-rate equipment, such as the Soviet MiG-29 Fulcrum and the French Mirage F-1 fighter. Yet their air force never put up serious opposition. Dr. Norman Friedman, a former nuclear strategist with the Hudson Institute, is the author of a recent book analyzing the lessons of the Gulf War.
I think the Iraqi Air Force failed because the Iraqi Air Force had been castrated pre-war by Saddam Hussein. I think that Saddam Hussein was very uninterested in having an effective, well-trained, enthusiastic Air Force because he thought that Air Force would end up overthrowing him. And in his mind, the thing that mattered most was to stay in business in Iraq. Always remember that he starts in life not as a young military officer, he starts out as a young revolutionary. In fact, he watches one revolution in which he participates go down the tubes when the army knocks it down. And the second revolution, which finally works, the second coup, I should say, it's not really a revolution, is an army coup on which his group piggybacks. The first thing he does as their chief of security is get rid of the army. And the army in this case includes the Air Force. He's painfully aware that in a lot of the third world, the way a coup is run is that someone bombs the presidential palace from an airplane. Why should he want a lot of pilots who are very good at doing that? What he wants is a lot of airplanes that look impressive to his neighbors, but as far as making them work well, forget it. In fact, there's a British observer of their training in the months before the war actually started who was surprised by how elementary it was. They didn't want to keep up that kind of capability, and the pilots knew it.
The Desert Storm air operations marked the first serious combat debut of stealth aircraft. Stealth aircraft, such as the F-117A strike fighter, are a direct outcome of the lessons of overcoming air defenses learned in Vietnam. If the enemy's radar can be blinded, his air defenses can be rendered ineffective. In Vietnam, as well as in the Gulf War, the traditional methods were twofold. Radars could be destroyed by radiation-seeking missiles. This is the job of the wild weasels. Wild weasels would find the radars on their sensors and attack them with harm anti-radiation missiles. The second traditional method was electronic jamming. This was the job of the Ravens. The Ravens would fly over the combat area and jam the enemy radars with their powerful electronic systems. Stealth was an entirely novel approach to the problem. The shape and construction of the aircraft prevented the enemy radar from seeing it, except at extremely close ranges. Armed with precision-guided bombs, the stealth strike fighter played a disproportionate role in the initial attacks. Although the stealth squadrons constituted only 2.5% of the attack force, they were responsible for attacking 31% of the targets on the first day, when air defenses were heaviest. But stealth involved more than defeating the enemy by near invisibility. It also meant the economy of combining the capabilities of many aircraft into one. While serving as a strike fighter, the F-117 does not require the assistance of electronic warfare aircraft like the Wild Weasel or the Raven. For example, the strike on the Iraqi nuclear reactor near Baghdad by 16 conventional F-16 strike fighters required a further 40 support aircraft and was not entirely successful. A follow-on strike by 8 F-117s was entirely successful and required the support of only 2 refueling tankers. Stealth aircraft, although more costly to purchase than conventional strike aircraft, demonstrate a significant advantage in the overall cost of a strike force. These experiences are shaping our notions of future combat aircraft. New generations of future American combat aircraft, such as the Air Force's Advanced Tactical Fighter, the Army's Comanche Scout Helicopter, and the Strategic Air Command's new bomber, are all based around stealth concepts pioneered by the stealth strike fighter in the Gulf War. In the face of the overwhelming odds posed by Allied air power, after the first few days, the Iraqi Air Force avoided air combat. The dogfighting that did occur was entirely lopsided. Iraqi fighters did not manage to shoot down a single Allied aircraft, while Allied fighters shot down over 30 Iraqi warplanes. The Iraqi Air Force, which seemed so imposing on paper, proved almost entirely incapable of putting up any serious resistance.
I think one of the big lessons of the war is that if you try to evaluate a third world country by adding up what it buys, you get a very wrong answer. That the way they use the equipment is really what counts, and it looks as though that's a combination of how well they train, which means how much time they're willing to spend on training, how many people they have to maintain the thing, which has to do with what sort of society they are, because if you have a society which is very poor in mechanically adept people, then they will not be able to maintain their equipment. They'll maintain it with foreigners. The foreigners may not care to stick around in combat, or in the case of this embargo, they may actually be forced to leave. So it's a very good lesson for people who have been analyzing third world countries for years. People look at the third world, they see a lot of money spent on military hardware, they say, oh, look at this, they have, say, a quarter of our strength, they have a sixth of our strength, they're the fourth largest air force in the world, and then it turns out that they're not any good. And it's a major intelligence problem for us that we've concentrated on numbers, and it's very difficult to quantify the factors which actually dominate. That's the problem. The people dominate.
Unable to challenge the Allies in the air, the Iraqi Air Force commanders sought to protect their aircraft by hiding them in concrete reinforced hangars. But the Allied air forces, with strategic targets largely eliminated, soon began attacking the hardened shelters. After the first few days of the air campaign, Iraqi aircraft began defecting to Iran. Were these individual defections or a conscious plan by Iraqi leaders?
The fundamental problem I think the Iraqis had were twofold. First of all, I don't think they anticipated the level of destruction that they were going to face. So therefore, their inclination was to try to preserve the assets, to have them available once the ground war broke out, or for any other option, including perhaps in the long run attacking their own people. I think this explains the sudden decision to send the aircraft into Iran. They suddenly realized that they weren't able to preserve these aircraft, that they were being destroyed on the ground, and that frightened them, which is why they took the risk of sending the planes into Iran. Despite the mediocre performance of the Air Force, it always has been given a lot of attention by the Ba'ath in Iraq. It's sort of their symbol of their entry into the high-tech modern world. So that the pilots tend to be people who are loyal to the regime. If this had been defections, my suspicion is that you would have seen a few planes fly off, then the internal security forces would have showed up and no planes would have taken off after that. Rather than being just a few isolated defections, I think this was a very conscious effort on the part of Saddam Hussein to save what he viewed as a very valuable asset. And given that the Iranians seemed inclined to keep those planes, it was probably a bad move on his part.
Although the Allied commanders had expected their air forces to win air superiority, many were surprised at how rapidly it was won and how few Allied casualties were being suffered. Within days, the Allied air forces would roam at will over Iraq, with opposition confined to low-altitude, uncoordinated anti-aircraft fire. This meant that the Allied air forces could also be used in the tactical role, attacking Iraqi troop concentrations, tanks, and artillery in the forward battle area. And it wasn't only the high-tech aircraft that did so well. Air Force planners, expecting to fight against Soviet air defenses in Central Europe, had disparaged aircraft like the A-10, the AC-130 gunship, and other slow aircraft as unsurvivable over the modern battlefield. But against an opponent like Iraq, unable to maintain a shield of air defense over its forces, These aircraft proved remarkably suitable for the close attack role. The Gulf War was a reminder of the crucial link between air combat and land warfare.
I think everybody expected Allied air power to dominate the campaign. What I found unexpected, and what I think a lot of people found unexpected, was the fact that we were able to use air power to basically destroy an entrenched army. In the past, we've seen a lot of examples where air power has been decisive against armies in retreat or on the move. But it's been very difficult for air forces to go against enemies who were dug in at even very rudimentary levels of fortification. One is reminded, for example, in the 1967 war, where most Israeli ground attack sorties were against dug-in Syrian troops and caused very few casualties. As a result, looking at this campaign, what's really intriguing is the fact that the Air Force was able to go in and essentially destroy a significant amount of dug-in equipment, despite some rather innovative efforts by the Iraqis to protect a lot of that equipment. And that, I think, has extremely important implications in terms of the role of air power in future conflicts in the Middle East and perhaps elsewhere.
If one image of the Gulf War predominates, it is that of the precision-guided bomb flying unerringly to its target. Ironically, the weapon that was at the center of this image, the laser-guided bomb, was not as new a weapon as most people thought. What was new was the more important role it played in the air campaign.
I don't really know why people were shocked by laser-guided bombs, since laser-guided bombs were invented during the Vietnam War, were used with great success and with a good deal of publicity at that time. For example, I think there was a famous bridge that was taken down by laser-guided bombs. Laser-guided bombs were also used in the raid on Tripoli in '86, again with a lot of publicity. I believe they were also used in the attacks on the Iranians in '87, again with publicity. The surprise was that there weren't that many of them. Because a laser-guided attack almost inevitably generates a video, most of what you saw in the way of videos were laser-guided attacks. And I think that many people had never seen that kind of video before. However, the bomb itself isn't all that different than the product that you would have seen, say, in 1970. It's a very simple device, very effective.
The difference between Vietnam and the Gulf War was the extent to which laser-guided bombs and other forms of precision-guided munitions were used. In Vietnam, laser-guided bombs were still exotic. In the Gulf War, they had become commonplace. About 9% of the bombs used were laser-guided bombs or other forms of precision munitions. Such weapons are more valuable than iron bombs in spite of their higher cost, since they require fewer combat missions to accomplish an objective. Typically, the precision-guided bombs struck their targets 90% of the time, while conventional bombs seldom hit more than 25% of the time. The attack on a pinpoint target such as a bridge would take dozens of missions using unguided bombs before the bridge would be destroyed. With precision-guided bombs, a few missions would accomplish the same task. And fewer missions meant that fewer aircraft were lost to enemy air defenses. The desire to save pilots' lives is not simply a humanitarian gesture. Fighter pilots are an enormously valuable asset to an air force, since their training often totals millions of dollars. There has been an increasing trend to use unmanned systems for especially dangerous missions. A good example of this was the Tomahawk cruise missile, used for the first time in combat during the Gulf War.
Oh, Tomahawk makes a tremendous difference, because you can fly Tomahawk in where you would worry about a pilot's survival. Also, because Tomahawk's precision doesn't depend upon being able to see the target terribly well, Tomahawk was used in bad weather, when the airplanes would not attack for fear of missing targets altogether. Now, Tomahawk doesn't deliver a very large warhead, but those two capabilities make that warhead very valuable as a force multiplier. It's very dangerous to think of Tomahawk as an alternative to airplanes. It's only about a 1,000-pound warhead. But Tomahawk buys you the ability to hit some key targets like air defense radars, air defense centers, after which the airplanes can deliver much larger loads. And I think that's exactly what we did.
The Iraqis also showed interest in missile warfare as a substitute for conventional aircraft. They had no alternative. Their aircraft were being shot down, but they expected that their Scud missiles would get through.
The Scuds, in the greater scheme of things, did not have that much of an impact in terms of the kinds of destruction that they caused. But they were the only weapon the Iraqis had that were accomplishing anything. So that you compare their Scud force to their Air Force, or even their whole army, they did a lot more with the Scuds than they did with anything else. And that, in part, I think, explains why they kept working at it. More than that, however, the missile force had a political impact which was far more important than whatever operational military implications the attacks might have had. If the Iraqis, for example, were going to drag Israel into the war, it was going to be through missile attacks. It's the only way they could hit the Israelis. And they came very close to succeeding on that front. If there hadn't been some prompt counter moves by the U.S. and its allies, it's very possible that we would have had that problem. And that might have completely changed the character of the war and of the post-war situation.
What the Iraqis had not counted on was the effectiveness of the Patriot missile. Never before in combat had ballistic missiles been shot down. Since the war, there have been some complaints that the Patriots did not shoot down every Scud at which they were fired. Yet few missiles of any type, anti-aircraft, anti-tank, anti-ship, have had as successful an engagement record as the Patriot in the Gulf. Patriot substantially reduced the threat posed by theater ballistic missiles. If the Soviet Scud missiles had some impact on the war, many of the other Soviet weapons did not. Saddam Hussein had purchased some of the finest weapons in the Soviet sales catalog, top-of-the-line fighters, tanks, and artillery. Does the Gulf War raise any questions about the quality of Soviet weapons?
It's very, very dangerous to think of the Iraqis as Soviets who speak a different language. The Soviets would have had a lot more technicians. They would probably have had much more competent operators. There's no question that they were supplying the Iraqis with standard hardware, although not their top-of-the-line hardware, except for the MiG-29. The problem is that the Soviets would have greater quantities. The Soviets would be much more aware of deficits in their style of operation, much more aware of how to fill those in. Now, I think the Soviets would have been horribly shocked at how well our equipment worked, horribly shocked at how flexible we are. The Soviets certainly share with the Iraqis a love of centralization and a very rigid style of command. That rigidity would have been very dangerous to them. On the other hand, the Soviets would have had a lot better chance at seeing what we were doing. Their reconnaissance assets would be infinitely better. For example, they would have had space assets that the Iraqis totally lacked. They probably would have had an air force so large that we couldn't put it out of business at one shot. The Air Force almost certainly would be a lot more enthusiastic about flying, which is a key point. As far as the weapons went, I think the only real test of weapon on weapon was on the ground. And yes, their tanks did very badly, period. They were awful. And that says if the Soviets had tried to invade Western Europe, probably they would not have been terribly happy with the outcome. On the other hand, as far as anti-aircraft goes, because our attack was directed at the central system, and because the Soviet central system may be somewhat different, it's very difficult to draw a clear conclusion. I would certainly, if I were Soviet, be nervous. Certainly, it would appear that a central system of the sort given to Iraq is not nearly as effective as people had imagined before the war.
If there was any real surprise about American weapons, it was that they worked so well. The M1 Abrams tank, long derided in the press as an unreliable gas guzzler, confounded its critics. The Bradley fighting vehicle, described in the editorials of America's prestige press as a death trap, demonstrated the value of its heavy firepower. The troops who were to use these weapons in combat did not share the general public's concerns.
The Bradley fighting vehicle is the finest machine on the battlefield of its type. Despite, and certainly despite, some of the press that it has received, it is capable, and I predict to you that it will emerge as one of the stellar performers on this battlefield. The munitions we have, the Apache Hellfire missile, are almost beyond comprehending in terms of their lethality.
Why was there such a disparity between the earlier press accounts of these weapons and their actual performance? It may be traced in part to the media's unfamiliarity with weapons technology. American weapons are tested far more rigorously than anywhere else in the world to ensure that they perform as expected. Yet these tests, when they uncover problems, serve as fodder for press criticism.
I think you'll find out the media was wrong about the weapons before the war because they've been reading the wrong things. Whenever a new weapon is tested, the test report is never, this is terrific. No, the test report is going to be, we don't like this feature, got to fix that feature, this thing doesn't work. And it has to be put pretty strongly because otherwise those who develop the weapon won't change it. So any evaluation report you ever read will read something like that. Now, if you know what all evaluation reports look like, no big surprise. If, on the other hand, you're curious about, say, the M1 tank, well, you exercise your rights, you get the evaluation report. Surprise, the evaluation report says this is terrible because. The purpose of the report is to make them change this feature. Very often the change is quite minor, you'd never even see it from the outside. The screen on this display can't be read in bright light, fix it. This engine has to be made more reliable against dust, fix it. Those fixes are made. And I think that the problem was that those who were reading these reports didn't realize what they were reading. That's not really their fault. They don't spend their whole lives looking for reports like that. And I would suspect that that was a problem.
One of the weapons which received critical attention before the war was the AH-64 Apache attack helicopter. Yet its superb performance in Desert Storm raises questions not about its capabilities, but rather about the importance of helicopters in future land wars. During Desert Storm, the helicopters played a fundamentally different role than in previous wars. In Korea and Vietnam, helicopters were used primarily to transport troops. In the Gulf War, this transport role remained important, but the helicopter's special ability to provide fast, mobile firepower to the ground forces became very evident. The attack helicopters destroyed over 1,000 Iraqi armored vehicles, making them the single most deadly anti-armor weapon of the war. The Apache and its other Marine and Army counterparts, such as the Cobra, can locate and identify pinpoint targets with greater ease than fast jets. Some observers have been paying attack helicopters special attention. A recent Soviet Army study concluded that the attack helicopters increased the combat capability of a United States tank division by more than 50%.
The Gulf War was certainly the most effective scenario you could imagine for the attack helicopter. The attack helicopter was, in many ways, the star of the ground war. It first had the advantages of terrain. There was obviously no triple canopy jungle in the desert. There was very little place for its targets to hide or for threats to hide. They can see all the threats. The helicopters could also operate by day or night, which they could not do in Vietnam or the earlier Middle East wars. And in fact, most of the U.S. Army, U.S. Marine Corps, most effective work was done at night. The air threat was less. There were no fixed-wing aircraft to come and chase the American helicopters away. The Iraqi ground-based air defenses were largely defeated after the first day, so they could not have a great threat to the helicopters. So this was very much the helicopters' war. I don't know if they would do as well at a lower intensity conflict in worse terrain or higher intensity conflict in Europe. However, it does show the attack helicopter is here to stay, and while it is vulnerable, it is perhaps no more vulnerable than any other system on the modern battlefield, where really anything that can be seen can be killed.
It is easy to get the impression that modern warfare is nothing more than a technological contest between machines. Yet these machines are merely tools in the hands of the soldiers, young men and increasingly young women. There was no better example of this than in the desert tank battles. The Allied tanks did have a decided technological edge over their Iraqi opponents, but the technological difference was not great enough to explain the desert tank battles where the Iraqis lost hundreds of tanks and the Allied units lost none. The answer lies more in tactics and training.
The one-sided nature of all of the ground war, especially the tank battles, was much more than just the superiority of Allied tanks over the Soviet-designed tanks used by the Iraqis. Yes, the U.S. M1A1 Abrams, the British Chieftain, French AMX-30 were indeed superior to the T-72s, which had most of the press, or the T-55s, which were the bulk of the Iraqi army, both older Soviet designs. But more important than this technical superiority was tactics, cohesion, gunnery. In all of these, the Allies were greatly superior. And we have seen in the past times when one side has such a lopsided advantage over its opponents. You can have similar results. In some tanks battles in the opening days of the Russian front of the Second World War, in some of the battles in the 1967 Middle East War, you saw similar one-sided results when one side was prepared, one side was trained, one side were basically cohesive units, and the other guy were just a bunch of guys in tanks who maybe knew how to drive their vehicle or fire the guns, but hadn't trained to fight in combined arms teams, combined armed combat in the very harsh realities of modern warfare.
One of the lessons of Vietnam was that the training offered American soldiers and pilots was not realistic enough. This led to such legendary training programs as the Top Gun School for Navy fighter pilots and Red Flag for the Air Force. Far less well known, but equally important to the victory in the Gulf War, was the Army's National Training Center in the deserts of Southern California.
The rise of effective training in the West, especially things such as the U.S. Army's National Training Center at Fort Irwin in California, or the U.S. Air Force's Red Flag and Green Flag exercises at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, were vital in making the victory in the Gulf happen. This was realistic training of a type we didn't see before other wars. We didn't see before Vietnam, certainly didn't see before the Second World War. The U.S. and its allies were willing to invest money in trying to make the exercises as much like real war as they can, to try and duplicate the conditions. Now, no exercise obviously can do this. At Fort Irwin, the fact that people don't bleed real blood puts limitations on what you can do. However, in duplicating the confusion, what's called the friction of the battlefield, the confusion, when if not people's lives, at least their careers are on the line, these were very important. And one of the comments you heard from many U.S. officers after the ground war finished was, it wasn't as rough as the National Training Center at Fort Irwin, thank goodness.
I think the training is 99% of it. We're all professionals. We all train very hard. We've been here a long time. It's kind of bringing things to a head, so to speak, and we're anxious to move things along. And we've known we felt it's been coming for a long time. And it wasn't really weren't real nervous about it. We just want to go out and do it. You don't have time to be afraid. And we knew what we were engaging, and again, we stay away out of their reach, so they can't reach out and touch us, but we can reach out and touch them. And again, more just anxiety and a little bit of cautious excitement.
The Gulf War has been belittled as nothing more than video war, antiseptic, nothing more stressful than an arcade game. But no matter how good the training and how sophisticated the equipment, fear is a constant companion in war. It is not part of the pilot's creed to express fear, but put yourself in the pilot's shoes. Air combat in the Gulf War, as often as not, was night missions. A pilot, alone, flying his jet at 500 miles per hour at 250 feet. One slip, and his jet is burnt and smashed over 20 acres of desert. For the lucky few in the more modern aircraft types, the claustrophobic darkness of a night mission is relieved by the strange reality offered by a night thermal sight. For most pilots, the only relief from the darkness is the enigmatic squiggles and blips of their terrain-following radars. The easiest duty is the two-seaters, the F-111s, the Tornadoes, the two-seat aircraft with a radar operator in the second seat. The toughest night missions are in the single-seaters, where the pilot faces his anxieties alone. But there is little time for fear. There is too much to do. Electronic warning systems screaming in your ear, radar screens to read, engine meters to monitor, the physical exertions of a 4G turn. Then there is the target. That little crosshair does not steer itself automatically. It takes a deft, calm hand. A pilot knows that if he misses, he'll just have to return the next night.
You're here standing on end when you're over there because you know, like last night, it was really dark down there, just a few lights, and you know that those people don't like you down there, and you know, if you had to go down, there would not be a friendly reception.
Okay.
Night combat played a more important role in Desert Storm than in any previous war. The new sensor technology and the superior training of the coalition forces allowed the Allies to exploit these night advantages. This was the case not only in the air war, but the ground war as well. Increasingly, the experience of modern warfare is being defined by advances in electronics.
The technology in the ground war was vital. In many cases, not just the shooting, the weapons, the ammunition, but other items that are often less publicized, such as sights, fire control. In the tank battles, the use of thermal imaging sights by U.S. M1A1 Abrams, British Challenger tanks was critical. Most of the tank battles were at night. You were using thermal imaging sights. The British and American tanks could fight at night, just as they would in daylight. The Iraqis, having older Soviet-designed, or in some cases Western-designed equipment, had to rely on infrared or even white light searchlights, which revealed their position. And they were indeed slaughtered at night before they could put around anywhere near the Allied tanks. The Allies had decided, starting in the late 70s, that they were facing a threat from the Soviets that would fight around the clock. And much of the Allied investment in the 1980s was not to expand the forces, but to make forces that could fight around the clock. And we demonstrated that in the war.
The Gulf War was won not only in the pristine aerospace plants of General Dynamics and McDonnell Douglas, but in the classrooms and briefing halls of military bases unknown to most Americans. The 1980s were a time of great intellectual ferment in the United States Armed Forces, an institution not often acknowledged for its intellectual prowess. At first, the burning question was, why did the United States lose in Vietnam? The lessons of this search sharpened the appetite of many professional officers. Enthusiasm for the study of the art of war came to be expected of ambitious combat leaders. The Gulf War was won as much by the products of these studies as by any weapons.
It's very difficult to disentangle whether you win a war because of your strengths or your adversary's weaknesses. I think, however, one thing is quite evident, and that is that the way this war was fought was very distinctive. The people who were responsible for planning it on the coalition side were very much aware of their strengths and their weaknesses, as well as their adversaries' strengths and weaknesses. And what it looks like our commanders did a good job of was exploiting the coalition strengths, minimizing the coalition weaknesses, minimizing the significance of the Iraqi strengths, and exploiting to the maximum the Iraqi weaknesses. That's a style of war fighting which has not typically been an American style, to focus your campaign on specifically on the adversary. But it's something that was done in this case to telling effect.
Intelligence is a key underpinning of skillful command, and intelligence played a key role in the Allied victory in the Gulf War. No nation can boast of the intelligence assets of the United States. The battle zone was layered with intelligence collection systems. In space, systems like the DSP satellite looked for traces of Scud missile launchers. Closer to the Earth, the TR-1 reconnaissance aircraft flew overhead, taking precise photographs of the battle area and monitoring Iraqi communications. The larger AWACS and J-STARS radar aircraft could scan behind the battle lines with their radars, seeing nearly anything that moved. Navy submarines patrolled offshore, their antennas secretly picking up Iraqi radio communications. Special forces groups scouted behind Iraqi lines. Before Desert Storm broke out, the U.S. forces knew the location of nearly every major Iraqi unit, right down to its tank and artillery concentrations. But did the U.S. intelligence community overestimate the capabilities of the Iraqi forces?
We have a tendency to count up numbers. Numbers are things you can actually touch. You can see how many tanks he has. You can see what kind. You can see how many airplanes. And the intelligence people will tend to give the numbers without footnotes such as no one is trained, no spare parts, bad mechanics, subtler things like forces that are not very good at operating together, forces that have never operated together. Furthermore, we're very bad at assessing third world armies in general. So you'll see a lot of assessments of the Iraqi army based on performance against Iran without the footnote, by this time Iran was exhausted. By this time the Iranian army was almost completely incapable of doing anything. There's a problem of overestimation because you can't really admit to yourself that the people you've spent years studying are awful beyond words. So there's a problem of intelligence that's both too much reliance on objective measures, too little interest in human factors, where the human factors are, say, 90% of what happens.
The American overestimation of Iraqi strength was mostly due to prudent conservatism in their assessments. Ultimately, it had no consequence in the outcome of the war. The Iraqis paid a far more serious price for overestimating their own capabilities.
There is much more than just accumulating hardware to make a military. This was one of Iraq's great fallacies. They thought because they had bought this vast army, they had bought a world-class fighting capability. This was wrong. They had bought what amounted to a collection of weapons, which in a few days, once the ground was started, was converted to a collection of scrap metal. It was not an army. It did not give them modern war-fighting capability. It might have sufficed against Iran, which had an even lower level, based on light infantry forces without a lot of sophistication. But when faced with the West's armed forces that had emerged from the buildup of the late 70s and early 1980s, they were just not in the same league.
The Iraqi failure was in no small measure due to the military incompetence of one man, Saddam Hussein.
What are your impressions of Saddam Hussein as a military strategist?
As I told you all for a very, very long time, it is very, very important for a military commander never to assume away the capabilities of his enemy. And when you're facing an enemy that is over 500,000 strong, has the reputation that they've had of fighting for 8 years, being combat-hardened veterans, had the number of tanks and the type of equipment they had, you don't assume away anything. So we certainly did not expect it to go this way. As far as Saddam Hussein being a great military strategist, he is neither a strategist, nor is he schooled in the operational art, nor is he a tactician, nor is he a general, nor is he as a soldier. Other than that, he's a great military man. I want you to know that.
Superficially, technology appears to account for the lopsided victory of the Allied forces in Desert Storm. But on closer examination, technology was only part of the answer. It was an intricate blend of new training programs and new concepts in tactics, which made the new technology so much more effective on the battlefield. Technology defined the parameters of the Gulf War. The skill of the Allied soldiers ensured the desert victory.
To order a video cassette of this program, call now 1-800-423-1212.